And I think it's very frustrating for young believers or young students of the Bible to pick it up and start reading it, and then you get lost. You don't know how it all ties together. And so that's why I counsel you, do not read your Bible from cover to cover. But I would also say read everything in it. And let me help you to know what you're reading and why you're reading and where it fits and why it's there. Now, for a young believer, you could read the Bible as I see it, either with a historical orientation, kind of like the storyline, the development of the history of redemption down to the coming of Christ and the establishment of the church. Or you could read the Bible from a topical viewpoint, oriented to what can I learn about God, about man, about sin, and salvation. Now, either one would be good to get you into Bible reading. But I do think you have to know what you are reading and why you are reading it. Now, I'm going to give you the suggestion that I make to most people when I finally get to the place of getting them to do daily devotions. I would suggest that you read first the Gospel of Mark. If you're brand new to this, jump in at the Gospel of Mark. Okay? You say, well, that's way down into the New Testament. Why should I read there? Because you see, you got to get to the heart of the story, first of all, if you're going to be interested in it. And the Gospel of Mark is the shortest, and the Gospel of Mark is oriented toward action. Jesus is presented as the wonder worker in Mark. It's very easy to get into that, and the stories just bang, 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 bang along. Not a lot of dialogue and exposition, as in John's Gospel. John's Gospel is wonderful, probably my favorite Gospel, in terms of subjective desires and all. But you need to start reading with Mark. And then after you read Mark, then take one of the longer Gospels. And for most people, I suggest that they read Luke. And the reason for that is because Luke was a Gentile. And you don't really appreciate John and Matthew until you get into the Jewish mindset. And to get into the Jewish mindset, I've got to get you to the Old Testament. So there's a method to my madness here. Read Mark, read Luke, okay? And then read Romans. Because about this time, you need to understand the doctrinal foundation of the Christian faith. I've given you the historical foundation, the life of Christ, his death and resurrection. Now I want you to understand what doctrinally is to be made of all this. And Romans is Paul's systematic theology par excellence. All of Paul's books are important. But in terms of a systematic presentation, Paul starts right there in Romans 1 and works it all the way out, through the 12th chapter, and then gets into, ethical and church concerns. So read Romans next. And then, having read Romans, you're going to ask some questions about the Old Testament. What is this about the Jews and election and so forth? Then read Genesis. And after Genesis, Exodus. Because I want you to get the early history of God's people. Okay? And then Isaiah. Isaiah, why? Well, again, I'm giving you bits and pieces of things, but it all fits together. After you get the early history, I want you to get the prophetic anticipation of the Messiah. And though that is found in many places, it's found in very large chunks in Isaiah, and it's easier to understand, especially, obviously, Isaiah 52, 3, 4, and 5, that section about the suffering servant of the Lord, so much of which, the idiom of which we find in the New Testament. Okay? Then go back and read one of the Jewish Gospels, Matthew or John. And then the Acts of the Apostles, so you understand the founding of the church. And then read 1 Peter, so that you have some experience of other apostolic literature besides Paul. Paul has quite a bit in the New Testament. It's easy for people just to read the letters of Paul, but I want you to read Peter and then John. Which one? How many books in the New Testament did John write? 5. That's right. The Gospel, 3 letters, and the Apocalypse, or the Revelation. So read the epistles of John after you've read Peter, and then read the Pauline epistles. I would prefer in historical order, but we haven't gotten into that yet. And then read the book of Revelation. As frightening as that may seem, I have some tapes on it, both short series and long series, if you want some help. But read the book of Revelation. There's a reason for that you'll see in just a minute. And then I'd like you to pick up some of the wisdom and praise literature of the Old Testament, Psalms and Proverbs. I would not suggest Ecclesiastes, Song of Songs yet. They're tough. Psalms and Proverbs. And with that, having gone through that, so you have some kind of topical presentation and experience with much of the literature of the Bible, then go and read your Bible from cover to cover. Okay? I hope you understand the rationale for this. You need to understand what the Bible is trying to teach you and how it teaches it, and get some experience in it. And with most fields, I'm just going to use computers as an example. When I was first encouraged to look into personal computing, I looked at that situation and I said, this is not my field. This is beyond me, and I don't have the time to give to it. And someone finally convinced me that it would help me because I love to revise the stuff that I've authored. They said, when you have it on a computer, you can go in there and revise it. You don't have to retype everything. I said, oh, maybe it's worthwhile then. So I looked at it and I got started. And the first time I read a computer manual, I'm sure I didn't understand more than 20% of it, but I understood enough how to turn it on and to do a few things. I said, hey, that's pretty neat. Then I went back and I did it again. And then I went from a real simple computing system, CP/M, to a more complicated one, MS-DOS, and I learned a word processing program and so forth. And I got better and better to the place that when I call WordStar now and I ask them questions, they say, you tell us, you know more about it than we do. Now, I'm sure there's somebody there that knows, but I'm talking to technicians that are supposed to answer questions, and I know more about it in some cases than they do. Now, how did that happen? Remember, this is the person who said I could never do any of that. You start and you get just a little bit of it. You just scratch the surface, as we say. Then you go back and you scratch a little deeper, and then a little deeper, and a little deeper. And the same is true of every subject and every field. No one jumps into any field and knows everything about it and is proficient right away. And so I'm going to give you a way to go in there and just scratch the surface, and then scratch it deeper, and then eventually you go back and hopefully you can understand a lot better what you're reading when you get to the Bible.